Hey everybody, it's Jason Blah here. Now that my two obligatory informative videos are done for the day, it's time to talk about current events in the online fitness community. And the other day, Scooby, the OG of YouTube fitness, made a video, and I covered his video because I felt like the video itself had a lot positive to say, and I didn't really want to spend a lot of time focused on this one little point. But Scooby made a profound statement that I wish more people in the YouTube and even online fitness world would address. And he said, and I quote, "Professional bodybuilding is nothing more than a contest to see who can use the most drugs without dying." Right, that's it. That's all it is. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skill at my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. And I'm glad someone who's been around in here and has the outreach and the long-term fan base that someone like Scooby has is saying the same thing I've been trying to say all this time. Because I feel like everyone wants to downplay it. Like when you bring this up, other people in the community, they want to say things like, well, of course, obviously there's some steroids in bodybuilding. They want to downplay as if training matters at all at a certain point with these guys. They want to downplay it to the point to where they act like most professional bodybuilders are, they're using a little bit of stuff. They're using a bit of stuff, right? And it also causes problems for all the millions of people out there who are very casual users who then when people find out they use stuff, they're like, well, why don't you look like that? Right? Because everyone is downplaying the amounts. Like it's at a point to where people need to understand, and that's the point that needs to be brought home. And this is why we have to discourage people away from the whole bodybuilding death cult. That's why it needs to be viewed as something negative. And there's a lot of people who try to say things like, well, I choose to be natural, but I still have a lot of respect for these guys. Really? That's like saying I choose not to use recreational drugs, but I'm still going to respect a guy who literally smokes crack to the point of where he dies out in the middle of the street at age 30. Right, that's basically what you're saying, because nothing they do has anything to do with health, with fitness, and they don't even really have to know how to lift at a certain point. Like most of them, if you watch them train, it's very obvious they have no clue what they're doing. And it's an even bigger problem if you try to pretend like what they do is just they train really effectively and they do know what they're doing and they just add some drugs on top of it. When you take that perspective, it then encourages people to emulate the nonsense that they do when people don't understand that at a certain point, and I've heard at least several writers decades ago even saying, look, if most of these pro bodybuilders, with the amount of stuff they put into their body and with their genetics, if they just did nothing but jumping jacks, they would still be way more jacked than the average guy at the gym. Like you would still think that they look monstrous. If all they did was jumping jacks and nothing else. And so that's the problem, is that then their training methods get highlighted and sold, and they sell training programs, and all these naive, silly-ass kids follow all the nonsense that they promote, thinking they're going to make progress, and they waste years of their lives. They waste years of their lives doing this stupid shit. And even worse, it gets glorified, it gets promoted, it gets used to sell products, when it is exactly what Scooby said. And I really, really have nothing but respect for him uttering that line. I might not agree with everything Scooby says. I might not respect everything about Scooby, but he had the balls to say what 90% of the people out here in the online fitness world are afraid to say. Professional bodybuilding is just a contest to see who can use the most drugs without dying. That is what it is. And you see that, and people will say, well, I have a lot of respect. Why? Why do you have respect for these guys? You have respect for guys who essentially abuse their bodies to the point to where they're a pincushion, where they're injecting stuff multiple times a day, every day, eating handfuls of pills, to the point to where sometimes they can't even train effectively anymore because their connective tissue becomes so weak relative to their muscle size they can't even do normal training because they risk getting hurt. Like if they tried to do the training that we know works for everyone else, they would end up just getting injured. They would get hurt under the amount of weights they would have to lift. They would snap tendons. They get hurt. Everything else if they tried to train correctly. They have to adjust and use goofy-ass form and ranges of motion because they're in so much pain from all the site enhancement and site injections and everything else that they do that their muscles don't even always contract correctly. And so they do a bunch of silly partial pumping reps. And they avoid full range of motion and everything else because their drug abuse puts them in a situation where a lot of them can't even train correctly anymore. And then people need to understand, let's talk about that's health and fitness. Well, what about the people who do use stuff, the millions of people out there who do recreationally choose to do things, who are fighting maybe for these things to be legalized, maybe want them to be legalized, and then you see these examples of abuse, and then they have to keep quiet about what they do because they don't want to be compared to them. And how many people do you see out there who say things like their justification and their cover, it's used as a cover. So let guys just use stuff and then pretend like maybe their training is a little better than they claim, their knowledge is better than they claim. When they're on gear, they're not on pro amounts. Yeah. And they say things like, well, I mean, I would never use because I'm not trying to get that big. As if, a little bit a year, like if someone who does 2 or 3 cycles a year could ever possibly get within 30 pounds of muscle of that freak, right? As if some anabolics will do it, when the reality is that's not the case. And it makes all these guys out here who are more casual users, it either gives them a cover to claim natural, or two, it makes them look ridiculous if anyone finds out they do use it. They can't even be honest about it. They can't even be honest about it because then they get compared to these guys who might be on 6 different anabolics at doses that could be scary high, even that the average user would be like, no, I'm not putting that amount into my body. Then they're stacking growth hormone, IGF-1, insulin. They're injecting insulin multiple times a day, thyroid hormones. They're not just on steroids, guys. That's not steroids. And it hasn't been for a long time, like 20 years. 20 years ago, it stopped being just steroids. Right? Arnold Schwarzenegger was that's what happens when you abuse steroids. Compare these guys with that. They're on entire cocktails of drugs. A lot of these guys are using 6 or 7 different drugs that aren't even anabolics anymore. Okay, they're not androgens at that point. They're stacking all this other stuff with insane doses of them. All right, some of these guys have drug bills that are $30,000+ a year. All right, they are walking lab experiments. They are walking lab experiments, and that's kind of the point. People will say things like, well, if I used gear, I would be that big. No, you wouldn't. You might not be able to take the amounts that they take without dying. You might not even be able to financially afford their bill, right? There, you got to keep in mind that some of these guys, their bill is what it would cost you to buy a new car every single year, right? Some of these guys, their bill exceeds your house note, your mortgage payment. They aren't just using a little bit sometimes. They are abusing insane amounts. Ridiculous amounts. And so, no, you're not going to look like that. In fact, you might not even be physically capable of handling the side effects of 50% of what they use. Again, it's like Scooby said, it is literally a contest to see who can take the most drugs without dying. It is rampant abuse. And people have to understand that difference. And there's this disconnect because you have the fitness world and people will say things and talk about it as if it's a positive thing in any way because then they can market it. And they don't want to be the one saying, hey, this is insane abuse. A lot of these guys don't even know anything about training or nutrition to look like that. They don't have to. They don't have to. All they got to do is just go to the gym and pump around with some fluff and pump and have good genetics and have a good tolerance of side effects. And they just, again, pen insane amounts. And didn't you guys remember when Dr. Mike and John Meadows had that discussion the other day that what they see in the bodybuilding world is themselves coaches, is they see a lot of that. If these guys don't have to know training knowledge, they don't have to know how to program. Even their coaches don't have to because they can just add more drugs. Every time there's a stall, instead of learning how to train correctly and learning how to program around it, they just up the dose. They just add another drug or double the amount of a drug they're on, and it fixes the problems. They don't have to learn how to train. And a lot of them don't. The majority of them don't. And it's painfully obvious. If you know anything about coaching or training, and then you watch these guys, it becomes painfully obvious that they don't know what they're doing. But then their nonsense can be marketed, and they turn a profit, and you have all these young guys following this silly crap and just spin their wheels as a result of it. People have to call it out because it's absolutely ludicrous. It is ludicrous, and it has nothing to do with fitness. And we as a fitness community really have to detach from this. And even the guys out there who are pro gear, who want it legalized and want to use a little bit themselves recreationally, you guys even need to be against this at this point because it makes you look bad. And it's going to make it harder for you to get stuff legalized. When you see people out there who are abusing these quantities and they're dying young and having health problems because they're stacking God knows what else with their gear. And they're using amounts that no sane person would use anyways. And that becomes the norm. That becomes the norm. And they never learn how to train because they simply don't have to. So I'm going to applaud Scooby for actually saying it. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.